These two pilots are flying an Airbus A330 across the Atlantic Ocean. It is a trip they have made hundreds of times. It is the middle of the night, and 4 hours have passed since they left Canada. Everything looks normal, and the pilots are in a good mood while the passengers are asleep. But then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they run out of fuel. Now put yourself in their place. What would you do if you lost both your engines and all you could see around you was darkness and you were over 120 kilometers away from the nearest airport? How would you save the lives of 306 people on board? This is not just a story about an air traffic incident. It is a story of human psychology, negligence, process failure, and skilled flying. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236, Toronto, Canada. It is August 23, 2001. Air Transat Flight 236 is a scheduled transatlantic flight from Pearson International Airport to Portela Airport in Lisbon, Portugal. 293 passengers, mostly tourists and vacation travelers, and 13 crew members were getting ready for their 7-hour journey. The plane for this flight was a 2-year-old Airbus A330. It first flew with Air Transat in 1999. The flight was powered by two powerful Rolls-Royce Trent 772 Bravo engines. The commander for this flight was 48-year-old Captain Robert Pichet. He had logged over 16,800 hours during his 20-year flying career, with around 800 hours of flying time on the A330. He was the pilot flying this part of the trip. The pilot monitoring was First Officer Dirk de Jager. At 28 years old, he had a total flying experience of 4,800 hours, with around 400 hours on this type of aircraft. At the time of the incident, Air Transat had been operating for around 14 years and had an excellent safety record. They had never had a fatal accident or lost an aircraft up to that point. But that safety record is going to change today. The crew loaded 46,900 kilos of fuel for their flight across the Atlantic. This was 4,500 kilos above the minimum requirement. The crew filed the flight plan, requested pushback, taxied to the runway, and then left Toronto at 052 UTC. Even though the A330 was fully computerized, standard operating procedure required the crew to manually calculate their direction, distance, and fuel remaining on board at every waypoint. The crew completed these checks as the flight crossed waypoints at 50° west and then at 40° west. At 0457 UTC, about 4 hours after takeoff, the plane was crossing 30° west, and it was time to complete the checklist again. Captain Pichet: "We are at 30°, FCOM check. Please." FO de Jager: "Fuel on board is 21.6 tons. It is within 1% of expected values, Captain. Fuel check complete." Narrator: But without the pilots knowing, something disastrous was already happening inside their airplane. 6 minutes later, at 0503 UTC, the crew got an unusual warning on their screens. FO de Jager: "Captain, there is something wrong with engine 2. Low oil quantity, high oil pressure, and low oil temperature readings." "Number 1 is looking fine, though." Narrator: "Oil temperatures usually only go up. They do not go down. A low oil temperature reading normally means there is a bad sensor. High oil pressure is also very rare, and most pilots go their whole career without seeing it. And when this happens, it usually means that the oil is contaminated with fuel. But sadly, this is not explained in the A330 manual, Captain Pichet. This does not make sense. Let us contact maintenance. Maybe they will know what to do." FO de Jager: "Mirabel Center, Transat 236. We have a problem. We have a warning on the ECAM for low oil temps and high oil pressure for engine number 2. I do not see anything in the FCOM or the QRH. Can you help?" Narrator: But the maintenance crew was not able to help find the root cause either. They told the pilots to keep watching the oil levels. Now, this is where human psychology starts to play a part. Because the readings were so unusual, and because the left engine's readings were completely fine, and also because low oil temperature readings are usually caused by a faulty sensor, the pilots thought what they were seeing was just a computer glitch, and that their plane was actually fine. And so they decided to keep going. Now, to understand the rest of the story, you need to understand how the fuel tanks work in an Airbus A330. The A330 stores fuel in the wings. There is a tank in the left wing that usually feeds the left engine, and there is a tank on the right that usually feeds the right engine. There is also a trim tank in the horizontal stabilizer. The purpose of the A330 trim tank is to keep the aircraft's center of gravity in the right place at all times. As the flight burns fuel, the weight of the aircraft near the wings gets lower. This would make the back of the plane heavier, pushing the center of gravity farther back. And when this happens, the airplane's computers will automatically move fuel from the trim tank to the wing tanks to keep the center of gravity balanced. During this transfer, the pilots will see a trim tank transfer message on the screen. And once the transfer is complete, a trim tank transfer message would show on the screen. This is normal and happens regularly on every flight. While the flight crew were looking into the unusual oil readings, the trim tank transfer system automatically started moving all the remaining fuel from the trim tank to the wing tanks. The trim tank transfer message was shown on the screen. But remember, the trim tank transfer happens on every flight. And here is where a second example of human psychology and decision-making plays a part. Because the pilots are used to seeing this message on every flight, they thought this was a routine display and did not pay much attention to it. What they failed to realize was that the trim tank transfer happened a whole hour earlier than it should have. What the pilots had not realized was that there was a major fuel leak in their right engine. A week before the incident flight, maintenance staff at Air Transat found an unrelated issue with the original right engine of this plane, and so they decided to replace it with a different one. But because Air Transat did not have a spare, Rolls-Royce loaned them a spare engine. However, the loaned engine was an older version compared to what the plane needed. Because of the differences between the versions, the fuel tube and the hydraulic tube would not fit properly. But the maintenance staff forced space between the two tubes and then approved the engine for normal use. The engine was put back on the aircraft, and after flying 68 hours over the course of a week, and while the plane was over the middle of the Atlantic, the fuel pump ruptured. The fuel leak had started at 04:38 UTC, and fuel had been leaking for over 30 minutes by this point. But as the fuel was leaking, the trim tank was automatically filling the right tank to keep the center of gravity balanced. And because of that, the pilots were unaware of the fuel leak. Their next manual check of the fuel quantity would have been at 20 Tarig West, which was still 20 minutes away. Because of the leak, the amount of fuel in the right tank was dropping faster than the left tank. But when the last trim tank transfer happened, it moved all the remaining fuel to the right tank. And so, as the fuel leak continued, there was no more fuel left to refill it. At 05:33 UTC, a fuel imbalance advisory message was shown on the ECAM screen. It was only at this time that the flight crew became aware of the imbalance between the left and right fuel tanks. But remember, they still had not considered the possibility of a fuel leak here. A fuel leak is a very rare event. Confirmation bias is starting to play a part. They have already convinced themselves that there is a glitch in the computers. For the crew, the fuel imbalance and the fuel quantity indications were unusual and hard to explain, which made them believe even more that this was just a computer error, and that the fuel quantity on their plane was actually fine. The crew's first response to the fuel imbalance message was to cross-feed the fuel from the left tank to the right tank to keep the balance. The captain completed this step from memory. But what he forgot was that the checklist had a warning that the cross-feed step should not be done if a fuel leak is suspected. But sadly, that was ignored. The cross-feed, of course, did not fix the problem. A few minutes later, the crew calculated that the fuel remaining on board was only 11,000 kilos. They should have had 20,000 kilos at this point. Captain Pichet, it is probably just a glitch. Let us keep monitoring. Narrator. These pilots had never seen a fuel leak or an unexplained low fuel quantity warning before, either in real life or in training. They are going to have to figure things out on their own. The fuel quantity kept dropping as they continued flying toward Portugal. At 05:45 UTC, the crew calculated that they no longer had enough fuel to reach Lisbon and decided to divert the plane to Lajes Airport in the Azores. At 05:48 UTC, the crew told ATC that the flight was diverting because of a fuel shortage and that they only had 7,000 kilos of fuel left. The captain asked the lead cabin crew member to do a visual check of the engines and wings for any sign of a fuel leak. Now, in the daytime, a fuel leak would be very easy to see, but in the middle of the night, it was almost impossible to spot. The cabin crew came back to the pilots and said this, F.A. I do not see any leaks or condensation on the wings. Captain Pichet, okay, it is probably just a computer error, But we are diverting to Lija's airport. The captain then told her to prepare the cabin for a landing, but most likely for a ditching in the Atlantic Ocean. The fuel on board was dropping quickly and was now at 4,800 kilos, 12,000 kilos less than what was planned. And 10 minutes later, at 0630 UTC, when the aircraft was at flight level 390 and 250 kilometers from Lija's, the right engine flamed out. 2 minutes later, the fuel dropped even further to 600 kilograms. The first officer declared a mayday with ATC. The Airbus A330 has an ETOPS 180 rating, which means it can fly on a single engine for up to 180 minutes, more than enough time for Air Transat 236 to reach the Azores. As long as nothing else goes wrong, the crew will be able to land this plane safely. But when the flight was 120 kilometers away from the runway, the left engine flamed out as well. The loud sound of the engines was now replaced by an eerie silence. Oxygen masks dropped because of the loss of pressurization, and the ram turbine was deployed to provide electrical power for critical instruments. With no engine power, Air Transat Flight 236 was now just a glider. You know how hard it is to turn your car's steering wheel when the engine is turned off. That is because your engine provides power for your power steering to work, and that is how heavy the control surfaces of this plane are feeling for Captain Pichet. Captain Pichet had one chance to get this aircraft onto the ground. He now needed to be very careful with how he flew this plane. If he flew at about 200 knots, he would not be able to lower the landing gear. If he flew below 140 knots, the ram turbine would not generate power. And if he made any mistake in his calculations, he would end up in the water, helped by military. Air traffic controllers and radar vectors from Lija's ATC, the crew carried out an engines-out visual approach. The weather was good, so they had that on their side. The aircraft was descending at about 2,000 feet per minute, and the crew calculated that they had about 15 to 20 minutes left before they would be forced to ditch in the ocean. To help find where the airport was, the crew asked ATC to keep flashing, the runway lights on and off. At 0631 UTC, the aircraft arrived 8 miles from the end of the runway, at about 13,000 feet. Sadly, they were too high to make it. The captain had to find a way to lose altitude fast. He made the hard decision to turn the plane around and do a 360-degree turn to lose altitude. If he got this wrong, they would end up in the Atlantic Ocean below them. He successfully completed the 360-degree turn, but sadly, he was still too high to reach the airport. So during the final approach, he made a series of S-turns to increase the distance traveled and to lose more altitude. The plane is now only a couple of miles away from the runway. Captain Pichet has one chance to land this plane. There are no do-overs. There are no go-arounds. This is it. The most important landing is being made right now. Just before the landing, the first officer gave a brace, brace, brace command. At 0645, the plane crossed the threshold of runway 33 at around 200 knots. They were landing so fast that the plane hit the ground and then bounced back up into the air. The captain did not want to become airborne again, so he pushed the stick forward to force the plane back onto the runway and then applied maximum braking. The plane came to a stop 2,000 feet from the end of the runway. Because of the force of the landing gear ruptured and a small fire started near the left main gear wheels. Emergency response vehicles at the scene quickly put out the fires. The captain ordered an emergency evacuation, and 14 passengers and 2 crew members received minor injuries. 2 other passengers received serious injuries during the evacuation. The final report identified the root cause as poor maintenance practices by Air Transat's maintenance staff. It also blamed the flight crew for not recognizing that a fuel leak existed and for carrying out a fuel imbalance procedure checklist from memory. The report said that if the captain had completed the fuel leak checklist when the first signs of a leak appeared, the plane would have reached the Azores with fuel still remaining on board. Air Transat accepted responsibility and was fined $250,000 for the accident, which at the time was the largest fine in Canadian history. Captain Pichet was awarded the Superior Airmanship Award in 2002 for his extraordinary achievement of gliding. A passenger aircraft without engines for nearly 120 kilometers. It is the farthest anyone has ever done it.